A rising chill. Essentially, what we're going to do in this module is look at some of the key events between 1945 and 1948 to assess how they essentially magnified the gulf between Stalin and the West. So this, in a way, is a search for the origins of the Cold War, a rivalry that would hang over the post-war world for a long 40 years, and a context that would dictate many of the events that took place across the global stage. Now, the textbook goes into more detail on some of these events. I just want to highlight them in a way, in a very general way, to show you the escalating tensions between 1945 and 1946. One event that was, really upsetting to Winston Churchill was Stalin's arrest of the London Poles. These were politicians that had been living in exile in Britain and which had gone home under agreements that had been negotiated between the West and Stalin, that they would be able to mobilize and participate in free elections. When it quickly became apparent to Stalin that these Western politicians would have a lot of support and would take Poland in a non-Bolshevik direction, he interfered very vigorously to either intimidate these politicians, to separate them from voters, and ultimately to arrest them on trumped-up charges, violating his the formal terms of his agreements with his other Western partners. Another incident was Patton's promise during a Sunday school class that, essentially that the United States would be best served given, Soviet intransigence. Maybe we should rearm the Wehrmacht and we'll go in and, attack the Soviet Union together. This was, a bridge too far. The Americans were, just glad that the war was over. They were demobilizing. Japan had surrendered. They had turned the page, and here's, Patton, trying to launch World War III, 6 months after World War II is done, by attacking our ally who had, helped us to defeat the Nazis. So this was absolutely a bridge too far. No way the Americans were going to go for this, and this was the last media faux pas for General Patton. He was retired and brought home. Another contentious event was the cold winter of 45 and 46. Perhaps 200,000, mostly children, died through a combination being malnourished or from hypothermia. One reason was that Stalin was not shipping coal and wheat to the West, which was, the idea of the ACC is that the Soviet Union would come into the Western zone and take out industrial equipment, which they would send to the Soviet Union, and the resources would flow from the East to feed West Germany. When Stalin refused to give these goods, not a single train came over to the western side. The United States and Britain were forced to buy food on world markets, and rather than Germany paying for its own occupation, it was the victorious Allies that were paying to keep Germany alive. So essentially in 1946, General Clay says this is nuts. He decides that, since the Soviet Union isn't playing the game, he kicks the Soviet inspectors out of West Germany. They can no longer take up West German industrial equipment. He also decides that Germany should be reindustrialized. He begins to open the factories so that they can sell goods and pay for their own food, and it won't fall on American taxpayers. This angers the Soviets, so by early 1946, the ACC is a stalemate, that sometimes the Soviets walk out, other times they insult the West, and essentially the joint occupation is just a mess. There's no way to govern these territories collaboratively when both sides are taking turns pissing on each other's heads. Now, a very important moment is Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. Churchill's no longer in power. He's already been out of power almost a year. But he ventures to Harry Truman's hometown in Fulton, Missouri. And there he gives what is now known as the Iron Curtain speech, although an early draft, the title was The Sinews of Peace. The emphasis and the press framing of this speech is the Iron Curtain speech. Now, anyway, Churchill has a pretty high reputation among Americans because he was the leader of Britain. He had stood up to Nazi Germany. He had piloted, Britain through the war, and also in 1938 during the Munich conference, he had warned about the dangers of fascism. So he had, this little reputation of being a prophet. And now what he did, much to the surprise and chagrin of Americans, is that he warned Americans that there was, essentially another war that was brewing. He accused Stalin of violating the Yalta Accord, imposing communism in his areas of control. He argued that Stalin was really very different, no different from Hitler. They were anti-liberal, against freedom. So this is why he was behaving this way in Eastern Europe. And he essentially presented this as a clash of civilizations. It's liberal democracy, freedom, and Christianity versus communism, tyranny. So essentially what he was warning the United States is, you can't retreat back to your isolationism because there's evil forces of work. This dark cloud has descended on Europe. The lights are going out. And the United States is the only country that can come out and essentially stabilize the world. Now, the Americans didn't take too kindly to this speech. They'd been surprised, confused, and they were very happy focusing on their own backyard and reconstruction. The last thing they wanted to do is to become embroiled in some other European war with a former ally. But ultimately, the speech is significant because it presents an image in the American public mind of communism as this dark force that casts a shadow, and that this represents a threat to the American way of life. Now, Stalin heard about the speech too, and he was not too happy about it. About a week later, in Pravda Izvesta, I forget now which it was, he gave an interview where he gave his read on Churchill's speech, and he basically offered a systematic rebuttal to Churchill's arguments. What he argued is, I didn't do anything, except, honor my end of the deal. I didn't complain when you went to Denmark and imposed democracy. We're applying social democracy to Poland, right? We're creating a socialist society. You're calling it communism. Well, you're calling it communism, Churchill, because you don't understand socialism. In fact, you were kicked out by the Labour Party because you didn't understand socialism. This is what people want. I'm not imposing communism. It's ordinary Poles and Romanians that are asking for socialism because capitalism did not serve them well. And, in rebuttal to what, he had said about Stalin being a dictator and a tyrant, he said, well, Churchill, you're a racist. You think that, freedom is somehow an Anglo-American idea and other people aren't capable of it. What you don't understand is, the freedom that people in Eastern Europe want is freedom from want. They want material security. Socialism to them is freedom, not the empty liberal freedom that, you are defining it as. So in this sense, he says that Stalin or Churchill, by doing this Iron Curtain speech, is essentially declaring war on the friendly Soviet Union that was essentially the major player that defeated their common enemy. So he was essentially beating the drums for war. So you can see, here's Churchill, here's Stalin, former members of the Big Three. Now, rather than be partners, rather than shaking hands together, what are they doing? They're hurling insults at each other. Essentially, it's a reset to the 1930s, where communism and democracy saw themselves as antithetical and having mutually incompatible aims. Now, in the year following the Iron Curtain speech, I see international history as really being driven by Stalin. In particular, Stalin thinks he's been treated unfairly, and he's essentially trying to get what he thinks he deserves by using hardline diplomacy and force. So I can't go into all the details of these events, but relative to Turkey, he puts a lot of pressure on Istanbul so that the Soviet Navy will have access rights to the Mediterranean. Ultimately, he's forced to retreat when the United States plays what's called atomic diplomacy. In other words, they remind Stalin, we've got the nuclear bomb, you do not, you better back off. So this essentially works. Stalin does back off. He also tells Beria to get working to develop the Soviet bombs, so that they'll have a counterweight to this type of atomic bullying. Subsequently in Iran, again, Stalin is putting a lot of pressure on Iran for oil rights in the north. Ultimately, a combination of British and American pressure and some subterfuge gets the Soviet troops out, and he doesn't get what he wants. So in his Bolshoi speech in 1946, Stalin is a new man, and in a sense he's reverting back to the Stalin of the late 1920s. He's talking about the divide in the world between the rich nations and the have-not nations, and how the rich nations, like the United States, in other words, are not helping the poor nations of Europe, like the Soviet Union, that sacrificed so much to end fascism. And on the American side, it's the same thing. Kennan's long telegram is about the Soviet system and how they fundamentally try to expand unless you use force as a language to contain their aggression. Then the Zhdanov's two camp speech is reverting back to the days of early Bolshevism, that essentially the Bolsheviks are fighting for the freedom of humanity from capitalist exploitation, where the capitalist powers are trying to get a stranglehold over the world's resources. So by 1947, essentially what you see is the ideological Cold War is in full fruition, at the same time that in a technical sense, the Soviet Union and America are still allies, caught together in the framework of these agreements, jointly occupying a defeated Germany. But ideologically, they've framed this as a clash of civilizations, two different ways of life, no way to negotiate a middle passage between what they both want from the future of the world. So it's in this context that the very word Cold War is used. It is not a formal, conventional war. Essentially, both sides are defining their partner as a rival civilization, and they're secretly trying to undermine him at the same time as publicly remaining the framework of international agreements. So on the Soviet side, there's a lot of interference to ensure that the communists become the dominant political force in Eastern Europe. There's a formula that he uses. I can't go into all the details, but he essentially builds up communist parties. He folds socialist parties into communist parties to increase their mass. He prevents the church and liberal and peasant parties from organizing, and essentially he through a revolution from above, he establishes a communist party dictatorship throughout Eastern Europe. In 1947, Truman, looking at the world, gives a very famous speech. Now, on the surface, this congressional speech is about building public support for military aid for Greece and Turkey. states that are at the periphery of the Soviet Union, in various ways threatened by Soviet or communist subversion. One of the things that's significant about his speech is not only is he arguing for essentially abandoning isolationism to become involved in Europe's problems, which is a hard sell for the American people, but he tries to justify this by appealing to the idea of American exceptionalism. That America has a God-given sacred role to spread freedom across the world. Now freedom is being challenged by tyranny. He doesn't name the Soviet Union by name per se, but he argues, countries like Greece and Turkey, they may seem very far from Iowa, but he essentially is, invoking kind of the domino theory. Ultimately, if communism spreads, it's going to be, coming to our doorstep, and our freedoms at home will be imperiled. So we've got a skin in the game. If communism prevails in Greece, it's eventually going to weaken our influence, close off markets to our businesses, threaten our domestic freedom. So essentially what he's arguing is what Kennan had suggested. He's not using the word containment, but this is essentially what he's arguing, is that the United States, as the traditional exporter of freedom, now had to become the defender of freedom, especially these countries that were under the threat of tyranny. This was a holy war. It was a clash of civilizations. This was the good fight. American public should support this reorientation of American foreign policy. The subsequent chapter of international diplomacy is dominated by the U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall. Seeing the animosity between the Soviet Union and the West, George Marshall goes along with his to the Council of Foreign Ministers and tries to break the deadlock. He's trying to figure out what does the Soviet Union need to come up to a grand settlement and to resolve the German question, so that there's a structure for security in Europe and America can pull out its occupation forces. It's already been 2 years, so the time is nigh. But when Marshall is prodding Molotov and trying to figure out what does the Soviet Union want so they can create a deal, it's becoming apparent to him that Molotov isn't being forthcoming. So eventually he's corners Stalin and says, what do you need? What do you want? Tell me what it is, and I'll try to make it happen. And when Stalin says, well, George, you just got to be patient, it dawns on Marshall that the Soviet Union doesn't want a deal. The Soviet Union believes that the chaos in Germany, the slow pace of reconstruction in Western Europe, is essentially setting the stage for a market crisis that's going to lead to more and more people supporting communist parties. In particular, there's elections in both France and Italy, where the Communist Party is polling very well and could potentially win the elections. So Marshall comes to the agreement, okay, they don't want a deal. They're not being fair brokers. So, we're going to have to come up with a settlement on our own. So a unilateral settlement means the United States is going to have to go to Britain and France and essentially agree on a settlement that doesn't include the Soviet Union. So the more hydline tack, the unilateral approach, is what sets the stage for the Truman speech, the Truman Doctrine speech, and also the Marshall Plan, which is one of the great successes of American foreign policy. The United States essentially offers to provide monetary aid, over $8 billion in aid, to rebuild Western Europe. In other words, to stimulate economic recovery, to wean these democratic states away from socialist reforms, to open and integrate their markets with the United States, and to marginalize the Communist Party that's making a headway in certain places, particularly Italy. Marshall also commits to essentially rehabilitating the western zones of Germany. Since the Soviet Union is not willing to come up with a deal on the German question, we might as well get the economy going. Germany's the industrial dynamo, the beating heart of the European economy. We get those factories moving. They're going to provide raw goods. It's going to stimulate all the economies of Europe and stimulate a broader recovery. So in the London Conference of March 1948, kind of building on an earlier precedent, Marshall essentially negotiates with Britain to create a unilateral settlement. They're going to reintegrate the western zones of Germany. Stalin, who has infiltrated the British government, knows all about these negotiations and isn't happy about it. He realizes that his hardline stance has been a mistake, and it's going to culminate in the reunification of Western Germany and its integration in the Western Bloc, and potentially its eventual remilitarization, which is going to be the number one thing that he needed to accomplish at Yalta and Potsdam is not going to play out. So, Stalin is getting pretty desperate, and the way he responds to the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the plans to reintegrate West Germany is essentially goes on the attack. Particularly, he reestablishes Communist International. It's called Communist Information Agency. It's essentially a conduit to the communist parties in Western Europe, including the labor unions. The labor unions go on national strikes. They try to destabilize the governments, particularly of France and Italy. He tries to destabilize these countries so the communists can win, although he's ultimately unsuccessful in that because the CIA is able to sway these elections in its first big mission towards the Western coalition. And in February 1948, when Czechoslovakia threatens to leave the Soviet bloc, Stalin orchestrates a coup to bring it back into the fold. So what you can see is that by 1947, essentially the Cold War is on. They're still partners, but both sides have essentially gone their own way. And then from 47 to 48, both sides are essentially using the war in the shadows to attack each other, whether it's to subvert the democracies, and France or Italy or the United States has its own subversion in the East, including, from Stalin's point of view, the Marshall Plan, which is an attempt to weaken Stalin's grip on Eastern Europe. So, what you can see is, if you're looking at this history from 1945 to 1948, is how, the World War, in a way, morphs into the Cold War. The inability of the victors of World War II to come to a grand settlement creates these unresolved issues that eventually lead to the partitioning of Europe and the United States and the Soviet Union becoming principal rivals for the post-war world.